History remembers empires not only by the monuments they built, but by the punishments they inflicted. In ancient China, the courts of the Han, Tang, and Ming dynasties carried out sentences designed not merely to eliminate an emperor's enemies, but to erase their influence across generations. Behind palace walls, where ministers whispered in fear and eunuchs moved like shadows, justice often followed the shape of power rather than the rhythm of law. A single accusation could determine the fate of an entire clan, and the methods used to silence dissent were shaped by centuries of ritual, philosophy, and political paranoia. Officials recorded these punishments with cold precision. Bamboo strips described procedures carried out in Chang'an during the reign of Emperor Wu in 119 BCE. Ming court documents detailed interrogations performed in Nanjing under the Hongwu Emperor in 1370 CE. The language used was modest, almost detached, but the consequences were devastating. For the enemies of the throne, punishment was not only physical, it was symbolic, designed to warn others who might challenge the mandate of heaven. What unfolded in these chambers was not chaos, but a system, a structure of fear, a quiet machinery built to defend the emperor's will, no matter the cost. In the spring of 112 BCE, the capital city of Chang'an prepared for rituals honoring the ancestors of the Han royal line. The markets burned incense in long clay braziers, and the stone corridors of the imperial palace echoed with the footsteps of envoys arriving for the ceremony. Amid this carefully arranged order, a quiet disturbance began with a folded memorial submitted to the court of Emperor Wu. The memorial accused a minor official named Liang Zhen of spreading omens that questioned the emperor's military campaign against the Xiongnu. His name appeared only once in the document, but that was enough to set the process in motion. Liang Zhen lived in the western ward of Chang'an, near the Weiyang palace walls. Neighbors recalled seeing him carry bundles of bamboo slips, and his wife, Shen Hui, tended to their small courtyard garden. Nothing about the family suggested treason, yet the memorial bore the seal of Minister Zhao An, an influential figure who had risen rapidly after the 117 BCE reforms. When the censorate received the memorial, they treated it as truth. They always did when a minister of Zhao An's rank submitted a charge. At dawn the next day, 3 palace guards and a court scribe arrived at Liang Zhen's home. They did not enter immediately. Instead, they unrolled a red silk decree outside the gate and read aloud the emperor's command. The suspect is to be taken for questioning under the statutes governing harmful speech. The neighbors gathered in silence. The phrase harmful speech had appeared frequently in cases recorded during the earlier reign of Emperor Jing, and everyone understood what it meant. Words could become weapons, therefore, the one who spoke them was treated as an enemy. Liang Zhen was taken to the Northern Interrogation Hall, a stone building established during the reforms of 128 BCE. Records discovered in the Han bamboo archives describe its layout: a central chamber, 2 side rooms for scribes, and a rear courtyard reserved for instruments used during questioning. The hall did not operate with the chaos of later dynasties. Its procedures followed strict guidelines from the statutes on investigation and adjudication, a text compiled during the rule of Emperor Wen. Every step from the first question to the final report had been shaped by decades of bureaucratic refinement. Inside the hall, Liang Zhen denied the accusations. He claimed he had copied astronomical predictions that others had written and had not intended to criticize the emperor's campaign. But intention mattered little. The empire believed that omens carried power, and anyone who repeated them risked influencing public thought. The scribe recorded his denial on bamboo strips, then handed them to the chief investigator, Magistrate Han Rong. Han Rong had served the court since 125 BCE and had overseen dozens of examinations. His method was consistent: begin with questions, escalate to pressure, and if resistance remained, authorize the first level of physical compulsion permitted under Han law. The law restricted the severity of these methods, at least in theory. Yet even the mildest form of compulsion, known as qishun, pressing the limbs, left deep bruises on the body and weakened the will to resist. Liang Zhen held to his denial through the first round. His answers were steady. though his hands trembled. When the scribe delivered the bamboo strips to Han Rong, the magistrate placed them beside a larger document bearing Minister Zhao An's seal. The contrast was unmistakable. Between the testimony of a minor official and the accusation of a powerful minister, only one carried the weight to determine the outcome. By the second night, a new decree arrived from the palace. The emperor had authorized extended investigation, citing the potential danger of omens influencing troop morale on the northern frontier. The phrase extended investigation appeared frequently in court annals during the period between 120 and 110 BCE. It did not specify torture, yet everyone understood that it granted investigators permission to use harsher methods. What happened in the hall after that point was not recorded in detail. The scribes wrote only that the suspect confessed to the transmission of harmful speech on the night of the fourth day. Whether Liang Zhen genuinely changed his testimony or simply reached the limit of endurance remains unknown. Shortly after the confession, an order was issued. The entire household of Liang Zhen was to be relocated and their property seized. His wife, Shen Hui, and their daughter were escorted beyond the city walls at dusk. Neighbors later recalled that their home was empty by the next morning, as though the family had vanished. Court records mention them no further. Liang Zhen's case was brief, methodical, and efficient, a demonstration of how the machinery of empire could erase a life not with spectacle, but with silence, paperwork, and procedures refined over generations. In the second year of Emperor Xuanzong's reign, 713 CE, the imperial archives in Chang'an expanded to include a new division known as the Registry of Anomalous Conduct. Its purpose was not publicly stated, though scholars in the Directorate of Education noted that the registry collected incidents involving unusual speech, unapproved writings, and private gatherings among the literati. Tang law, shaped by centuries of precedent, rarely punished dissent on its surface. Yet beneath the elegant calligraphy of the Tang Code, the state maintained a subtler network of observation. From this network came the case of a poet named Wen Shilin. Wen Shilin lived near the Qujiang Canal in the southeastern quarter of the capital. He was known for his quiet manner and for poems that he copied on narrow strips of mulberry paper. Many of these verses referenced mountains, wind, or the turning of seasons. But during the Lantern Festival of 712 CE, he shared a handwritten poem comparing the emperor's reforms to rains that fall unevenly upon weary fields. The line was ambiguous, but ambiguity had become dangerous after the political tensions that followed the brief rule of Emperor Ruizong. A courier delivered a sealed report to the registry, claiming that Wen Shilin's poem carried a hidden criticism of the new administration, specifically the reforms overseen by Chancellor Yao Chong. The accusation did not state that Wen Shilin intended sedition. It simply alleged improper metaphor. Yet the registry had been created for this exact purpose, to catalog minor breaches before they grew into larger threats. Two officials, Inspector Ma Li and Scribe Zhao Kan, were assigned to conduct the preliminary inquiry. Ma Li, a veteran of the frontier administration, believed that language could stir unrest as effectively as weapons. Zhao Kan, younger and cautious, followed him through the narrow lanes leading to Wen Shilin's home. The residence was modest, with a tiled roof and a courtyard where plum blossoms were beginning to open. The poet greeted them with formal courtesy, unaware of the report submitted against him. Inspector Ma Li presented the written accusation. Wen Shilin's face remained calm, though the lines around his mouth tightened. He explained that the poem referred only to seasonal storms, not to the government. Zhao Kan copied his words into the registry scroll, but Ma Li pressed further. He requested the poet's original manuscripts for examination. Wen Shilin hesitated before opening a small chest containing bundles of folded paper. Among these papers, the officials found a verse that mentioned a throne dimmed by distant clouds. The phrase was not specific, yet it troubled Ma Li, who had lived through the rebellions along the Hexi corridor in 703 CE. Even the faintest suggestion of instability could be construed as dangerous. He requested that Wen Shilan accompany them to the Southern Administrative Hall for clarification. The hall stood near the base of the city's southern watchtower, constructed during the reign of Emperor Gaozong. Its inner rooms held no instruments of torture, for Tang investigations often began with interpretation rather than force. The walls were lined with wooden shelves holding registers that chronicled thousands of minor infractions, lines of verse, overheard conversations, unusual gatherings, and anonymous rumors. These records formed a quiet landscape of suspicion beneath the brilliance of the Tang Golden Age. Wen Shilan sat across from a lacquered table as officials compared his poems with the reports submitted to the registry. The central question concerned intent. Did his metaphors reflect dissatisfaction with imperial policy, or were they merely artistic expressions? Scholars had debated such questions for decades, citing precedents from 649 CE to the early years of Emperor Zhongzong's rule. Yet the ultimate decision rested not on literary theory, but on the shifting political currents within the palace. Chancellor Yao Chong, though respected, had gained powerful rivals at court. Any perceived criticism of his reforms, even if unintended, risked being interpreted as support for his opponents. When the registry forwarded its findings to the Ministry of Justice, the officials there recommended mild corrective measures, a phrase used in numerous cases involving poets and scholars. The corrective measures included the confiscation of manuscripts and mandatory relocation. Wen Shilan was assigned to a provincial office in Jiangzhou, hundreds of li from Chang'an. The order was delivered at dawn. He was given 2 hours to prepare, after which an escort would accompany him southward along the post road. Neighbors later recalled the quiet departure. The poet walked slowly, carrying only a bundle of clothing and a single writing brush. His home, like many belonging to those investigated by the registry, remained sealed for months. The Tang court avoided overt displays of punishment, preferring measures that disrupted a life without drawing public attention. Relocation served that purpose well. A man removed from his city, separated from fellow scholars, and placed under watchful eyes. The Registry of Anomalous Conduct did not consider this an act of cruelty. It viewed such decisions as necessary adjustments to maintain harmony. The records for the year 713 CE list Wen Shilan's case briefly, noting only metaphor of unclear loyalty. It was neither the harshest nor the most unusual entry. Yet it demonstrated how, in the Tang dynasty, a single line of verse could shift the course of a life. In the first month of 546 CE, when the northern Wei capital of Luoyang struggled under court rivalry and tribal tension, a case emerged that revealed how punishment could operate not only as retribution, but as quiet theater. The emperor's authority, weakened by years of internal dispute between Gao Wan supporters and the Lu clan, depended on displays that reasserted the throne's reach. One such display involved a man named Qu Ren, once a clerk in the Ministry of Works. Qu Ren had served during the reforms initiated by Emperor Xiaowu in 532 CE, when the court attempted to stabilize food distribution along the Luo River basin. As factions shifted, Qu Ren found himself aligned with officials who fell from favor. He withdrew from public office and lived with his sister near the stone terraces south of the Yangning Temple. According to testimonies later gathered by magistrates, he rarely spoke of politics. Yet silence during unstable years often drew suspicion. In late winter of 545 CE, an informant claimed Qu Ren possessed documents copied from edicts issued by a rival faction earlier that decade. Whether he intended to use them remained unclear. Possession alone, officials argued, suggested hidden loyalties. The case was forwarded to the Provincial Bureau of Justice, whose offices were built adjacent to the ruins of the towering Yangning Pagoda, destroyed by fire in 534 CE. There, Magistrate Du Wei reviewed the accusations. Du Wei had served under 3 different administrations and understood how swiftly political tides could turn. His registers from previous years contained cases of officials punished not for rebellion, but for proximity to those later declared traitors. Qu Ren's case bore the same signature, guilt by association shaped by fragile politics. 2 guards escorted Kui Ren to the examination yard at the southern gate. The yard was not as elaborate as the grand halls of Chang'an. Instead, it consisted of a stone courtyard enclosed by low walls, with wooden beams supporting a tiled roof. The structure dated back to the late Northern Wei construction projects, around 510 CE. A single executioner, known only as Zhang Hu, presided over the corporal procedures authorized by the provincial court. His name appeared infrequently in records, but marginal notes written by scribes described him as meticulous, neither cruel nor lenient, carrying out orders with the calmness of a craftsman. Kui Ren maintained that the copied documents were remnants of his former duties, forgotten in a chest he had not opened for years. He insisted he had no connection to the disgraced officials whose names appeared in the texts. Magistrate Du Wei questioned him regarding the individuals listed, the dates of their service, and their supposed ties to surviving factions. Throughout the interrogation, a scribe recorded each answer with the precision required by Northern Wei protocol. These bamboo strips later formed part of the Luoyang case register for 546 CE, fragments of which were discovered in the early 20th century. When Kui Ren's testimony conflicted with the informant's report, the magistrate authorized the first stage of corporal inquiry. Under Northern Wei law, influenced by earlier Cao Wei statutes, punishments such as the Qi Xing, pressing punishment, and Fan Xing, rotating bar, were applied to compel clarity rather than confession. The court maintained that these methods revealed truth by testing consistency. The executioner Zhang Hu prepared the wooden frame in the courtyard, while two assistants tied Kui Ren's arms to its sides. Witness accounts written decades later described Zhang Hu's demeanor as steady, almost impersonal. He adjusted the ropes, ensuring equal tension, then turned a lever that tightened the pressure across Kui Ren's shoulders. The process produced no spectacle. It followed a measured rhythm, shaped by years of protocol. Kui Ren's breathing grew strained, yet he repeated his denial. The magistrate signaled for a brief pause, consulted with the scribe, and resumed questioning. The record does not specify when Kui Ren's resistance faltered. It states only that he became uncertain in his recollection on the third day of examination. In a period where shifting allegiance could determine one's fate, uncertainty itself was treated as evidence. The magistrate concluded that Kui Ren had failed to account for the documents in his possession and had likely retained them with improper intent. Under decree issued in the 9th year of Emperor Xiaowu, improper possession of seditious texts warranted punitive removal. Execution was not ordered publicly. Instead, a sealed directive instructed Zhang Hu to carry out Mozing ink branding, followed by exile to the northern frontier near Pingsheng, a region long associated with harsh living conditions. Branding marked a person permanently, both physically and socially. It removed him from the cycle of administrative service and placed him among those who lived beyond the city's concern. On a cold morning in early spring, Kui Ren was marched from the city toward the post road leading north. Travelers later reported seeing a man with fresh bandages around his arm, escorted by two guards in provincial uniforms. By the time they reached Pingcheng, weeks later, his name had begun fading from court discussion, absorbed into the wider conflicts reshaping the Northern Wei state. The case demonstrated the quiet precision with which punishment operated. There were no crowds, no proclamations, and no dramatic accusations. Instead, a single man's life was altered through procedure, paperwork, and the steady hand of an executioner who did only what the law allowed. In the turmoil of 546 CE, that was enough. During the late years of an early imperial reign, when border tensions pressed upon the treasury and murmurs spread through the ministries, the outer court developed a method of inquiry designed to uncover disloyalty without declaring it openly. The system relied on structured questioning conducted in a hall positioned between the palace's administrative quarter and the barracks. The hall itself was unremarkable timber pillars, clay-tiled roof, stone flooring worn by decades of foot traffic, but its purpose shaped the fate of many who passed through its gates. The process began with a summons delivered without explanation. A messenger would appear at a household just after dawn, reciting a brief order, the individual was required for clarification of recent administrative inconsistencies. No accusation, no charge. Those summoned understood that this phrasing signaled suspicion. Upon arrival at the hall, attendants guided them through a narrow passage into an antechamber where they waited in silence. The walls displayed nothing except a wooden plaque inscribed with regulations governing conduct during inquiry. Once called forward, the subject entered a larger room furnished with a single low table and 2 official seats. The officials remained calm, their questions measured, their posture steady. The first stage focused on routine matters, past duties, recorded statements, minor decisions made in preceding months. The intention was not to confirm guilt, but to establish patterns. Every answer was noted by a scribe who sat beside a lacquered chest filled with bamboo registers. After this initial stage, the officials introduced questions that traced subtle contradictions. These contradictions did not need to be significant. Even a misplaced reference, an uncertain recollection, or an answer delivered too quickly could be interpreted as concealment. The subject rarely understood which detail triggered deeper inquiry. This uncertainty was deliberate. The process sought to unsettle, not intimidate. The outer court held that truth emerged when a person, unable to anticipate the direction of questioning, revealed inconsistencies unintentionally. Those who maintained composure progressed to the next phase, conducted in a separate room known for its dimmer light and colder air. The room contained no instruments, no restraints, only a table and 2 lamps positioned low to the ground. Officials asked questions that blurred administrative matters with political undertones. These inquiries touched on conversations overheard in public spaces, observations made during rituals, or comments recorded secondhand by clerks. The boundaries of acceptable speech were narrow during this period, defined by seasonal edicts meant to preserve stability. Any deviation from the approved tone could be construed as a sign of dissent. The procedure allowed for extended sessions lasting several days. Subjects remained within the hall's inner quarters, sleeping on woven mats and eating plain meals provided at regulated hours. Each morning, officials reviewed the previous day's registers before continuing. They analyzed shifts in tone, differences in phrasing, and lapses in memory. These became markers from which conclusions were drawn. The goal was not to force confession, but to observe whether the subject's statements aligned with the court's expectations of loyalty. Occasionally, when answers diverged too sharply from recorded evidence, the inquiry escalated to what the outer court described as supportive measures. These measures did not involve overt violence. They consisted of physical discomfort, intended to clarify uncertain recollections, extended kneeling on coarse mats, arms held horizontally for prolonged periods, or standing in drafty corridors during nighttime questioning. The court justified these methods by stating that clarity of mind emerged when the body was disciplined. Registers often described these sessions only with the phrase "assistance applied," leaving the specifics unrecorded. Once the officials concluded their assessment, they drafted a statement summarizing their findings. Some subjects were released with a warning, their answers deemed insufficiently concerning. Others received orders for relocation or administrative demotion. In more severe cases, the matter was forwarded to higher authorities who determined whether physical punishment or public censure was warranted. The subjects seldom learned which detail determined their fate. A single ambiguous phrase, a momentary hesitation, or an inconsistent timeline could transform a minor inquiry into permanent removal. The outer court preserved its neutrality. It claimed that its purpose was neither punishment nor accusation, but preservation of imperial harmony. Yet those who experienced its questioning understood its true function. It was a labyrinth designed not to expose crime, but to reveal vulnerability, a system that measured loyalty through endurance, clarity, and the ability to navigate uncertainty. In the mid-years of an early dynasty, long before the capital shifted eastward, a chamber within the administrative compound gained an ominous reputation among clerks and attendants. Officially known as the Room of Document Verification, it appeared identical to the archive halls surrounding it: rows of wooden shelves, bundles of scrolls tied with hemp cord, tables arranged for review of reports and petitions. Yet the chamber served a purpose beyond record-keeping. It was where written evidence, once assembled, could quietly reshape the fate of any individual whose loyalty the court questioned. The process began with the collection of materials. Attendants retrieved petitions, routine reports, copied memoranda, and fragments of correspondence. None of these documents needed to contain overt transgressions. Even minor irregularities crossed out lines, discrepancies in dates, comments written in haste, could prompt further scrutiny. The court viewed writing as a reflection of the writer's sincerity. A person who concealed intentions, they believed, left traces in the gaps between ink strokes. Documents brought to the chamber were sorted into three categories: those reporting official duties, those mentioning state matters indirectly, and those containing personal reflections or notes. The second and third categories most often determine the direction of inquiry. A phrase interpreted too broadly, a metaphor perceived as criticism, or an entry written during a politically sensitive month could serve as grounds for suspicion. During periods of tension, the chamber might receive dozens of such scrolls each week. When a subject was summoned, attendants guided the individual to a low bench against the eastern wall. They were not told which documents had been collected. Instead, two officials entered carrying a stack of scrolls tied in red silk, the color reserved for materials requiring evaluation of intent. One official read selected passages aloud. Another observed the subject's expression and posture. Silence often revealed more than speech. A momentary pause or tightening of the jaw could be taken as confirmation that the individual recognized the text and feared its interpretation. Inquiries within the chamber followed a structured rhythm. The officials asked whether the handwriting belonged to the subject, whether the date matched their recollection, whether the phrasing was chosen deliberately. The subject's answers were copied onto new scrolls, creating a layered record: the original text, the accusation, the explanation. Over time, these records formed a paper landscape through which officials mapped perceived deviations from expected conduct. If the answers proved unsatisfactory, the officials conducted what the chamber referred to as interpretive restructuring. This involved reading a passage in multiple ways, each projecting a different political or ethical implication. The subject was asked to determine which meaning they intended. Rarely did any of the interpretations align perfectly with the individual's original thought. This mismatch served the court's goal: to demonstrate that ambiguous writing could endanger social order. Evidence need not reveal a crime. It merely needed to suggest the possibility of one. Those who attempted to defend themselves by citing classical texts or traditional commentaries often found their arguments turned against them. Authorities argued that quoting ancient sources implied comparison with present conditions, a subtle critique of governance. In several known cases, individuals who copied passages describing virtuous ministers or loyal advisors were accused of implying the absence of such virtue in their own time. If the subject's explanations continued to conflict with the officials' interpretations, the chamber transitioned to a more coercive stage. Although it contained no instruments of punishment, discomfort was introduced through repetition. Officials repeated questions for hours, sometimes returning to passages already discussed. Subjects remained seated on the low bench, unable to move freely. The monotony, combined with the pressure of interpretation, wore down their certainty. Eventually, many conceded that their writings could indeed be misread, a concession officials recorded as acknowledgement of impropriety. Upon conclusion, officials drafted a summary scroll to be delivered to higher authorities. The scroll did not declare guilt directly. Instead, it described inconsistencies in explanation, poorly chosen language, or failure to recognize the potential danger of certain phrasing. These summaries often influenced decisions regarding demotion, relocation, or further investigation. The subject rarely saw the completed document. Clerks who worked in nearby halls claimed that the chamber's door always closed softly, never with force. Yet the quiet that followed each closing carried a gravity that resonated across the compound. The room of document verification represented an approach to punishment shaped not by physical force, but by the power of interpretation. A life could be unmade through ink, silence, and the court's ability to read meaning into even the faintest stroke of a brush. During a period marked by shifting alliances and whispered concerns within the palace's inner circles, the authorities revived an older method of assessment that had originated centuries earlier in a frontier garrison. It was neither interrogation nor punishment in the direct sense. Instead, it examined conduct through posture, movement, and silence. Officials called it shadow measurement, though the term appeared nowhere in formal statutes. Records describe it only as a procedure used when the court sought to evaluate whether an individual concealed intentions that could disrupt stability. The courtyard designated for this method lay behind a row of storehouses along the northern administrative wing. Its walls were high enough to block the sun at certain hours, and low enough to allow angled light to fall sharply at others. This balance mattered. The officials who designed the procedure believed that a person's composure revealed itself when a long shadow stretched before them. The lengthening shadow represented exposure. The individual could not easily control how their movements appeared. Those summoned arrived without prior explanation. They were led to the courtyard center and instructed to stand at a marked spot on the stone tiles. No one spoke. Two officials positioned themselves along the perimeter, while a recorder sat behind a low table, brush in hand. When the sun reached the correct angle, the procedure began. The subject's shadow extended across the courtyard floor, and the officials began their observations. The method relied on subtlety. Officials watched not the person directly but the shape formed by their shadow. A steady outline suggested calm. Uneven movement indicated agitation. The officials asked controlled questions not about accusations, but about neutral matters, positions held in the past, duties performed during a previous season, places visited during a festival. The shadow often changed shape as the subject answered. Those changes were recorded in sparse notes using phrases such as shifted during recollection, held firm when questioned, or contracted before response. The philosophy behind this technique derived from older military practices in which commanders evaluated recruits by their stance at sunrise. The court adapted the practice for political use, asserting that physical composure reflected inner alignment with imperial order. While no legal text defined the criteria, officials claimed long experience allowed them to distinguish between natural tension and concealed unease. After the first round, the subject was instructed to walk from one tile to another along a predetermined path. This movement produced a new shadow configuration. Officials believed that during motion, a person revealed hesitation more readily. The recorder noted pauses, shifts in weight, or moments when the subject's pace quickened unexpectedly. None of these observations constituted direct evidence, yet they contributed to a broader assessment of reliability. If the officials remained uncertain, the procedure continued into the second phase. The subject was asked to repeat their answers from earlier inquiries conducted elsewhere. Any difference in phrasing or tone was compared against the behavior of the shadow. The officials argued that truth created consistency. Deviation suggested hidden motives. Subjects rarely understood how their shadow could influence judgment, and this confusion often led to restrained but visible tension, a factor the officials documented with meticulous detail. The procedure did not involve physical punishment, yet its psychological weight was considerable. The courtyard was quiet, the officials' expressions unreadable, the recorder's brush steady. The subject, aware of being observed in such an abstract manner, often struggled to control posture and breathing. The method's strength lay in its ambiguity. It left individuals unsure which aspect of their behavior mattered, compelling them to guard every movement. Once the observations concluded, the officials retreated to a side hall where they compiled their findings. The resulting document was brief, but influential. It categorized the subject's conduct into three types: aligned, uncertain, or obscured. Those labeled aligned were released without further inquiry. Those deemed uncertain were recommended for reassignment to distant posts where their influence diminished. Those marked obscured faced additional investigation, which could lead to harsher measures described in other registers. The courtyard itself bore no symbol of its purpose. After each session, attendants swept the tiles, leaving no trace of what had transpired. Yet many within the administrative compound recognized the place immediately. Even passing near its entrance caused officials to lower their voices. The procedure represented an aspect of ancient governance that measured not only words but hesitation, posture, and the silent language of the body. In a system that valued harmony above all, even a shadow could determine one's future. In an era when imperial power relied heavily on the flawless functioning of its bureaucratic machine, certain halls within the administrative compound maintained ledgers that extended far beyond simple accounting. These ledgers recorded not grain distribution, tax receipts, or military supplies, but behavior, speech patterns, choices made during routine duties, associations formed quietly over seasons. The court referred to these volumes as supplementary registers. Though many understood their true nature, they were instruments through which uncertainty could become accusation. The hall that housed these ledgers appeared modest. Rows of shelves lined the walls, each holding tall bamboo-bound volumes marked with years rather than subjects. A long central table allowed clerks to spread open multiple registers at once. The atmosphere resembled the calm order of any archive, yet those who entered sensed its weight. The sound of a brush scratching against bamboo in this hall could determine the course of a life more definitively than any proclamation outside. Every official, attendant, and courier employed in the government left a faint trail across the pages. The notes were brief, never dramatic. A delayed response to an order, a hesitation when receiving a directive, a question asked at an inappropriate time. These entries formed patterns only when viewed across multiple years. The court believed that true loyalty revealed itself not in isolated deeds but in long-term consistency. These ledgers charted that consistency. When concerns arose regarding an individual, investigators did not begin with interrogation. They visited this hall. A senior clerk retrieved volumes spanning several years, carrying them to a side table illuminated by a single oil lamp. There, the clerk and an attending official reviewed the entries one by one. Each note was small, often no more than a phrase, unclear in response, delayed at gate, absent from morning count. No single phrase warranted alarm, but together they could suggest a shift in conduct. Once initial patterns were identified, clerks expanded their search to linked registers. These contained references to individuals who had interacted with the subject, those who worked in the same office, attended the same festivals, or visited the same markets. The purpose was not to identify conspiracies, but to verify whether associations aligned with the court's expectations. When a person repeatedly appeared beside names already marked as uncertain or removed from office, the court interpreted it as a sign of influence or silent agreement. After the examination, clerks compiled a summary scroll. This scroll did not accuse the person of wrongdoing. Instead, it described trends, increased absence from official duties, inconsistent documentation, or a shift in tone noted by multiple supervisors. The language remained neutral, yet neutrality carried force. A single phrase such as "pattern suggests diminishing reliability" could lead superiors to initiate further inquiry. Subjects were seldom aware that the process had begun. They continued their duties while clerks in the hall assembled observations recorded over their entire career. Only when summoned did the individual understand that their fate had already been shaped by strokes of a brush from past seasons. When they stood before officials, the investigation did not focus on a single incident, but on the ledger's portrait of their behavior. In these inquiries, the subject was shown selected entries and asked to explain them. Why had they hesitated during a festival procession the previous year? Why did their report from 3 winters past differ in tone from earlier submissions? Why was their attendance irregular during a particular month? Though each question referred to dated notations, the true purpose was to evaluate the individual's reaction. Calm explanations suggested alignment. Defensive answers implied unease. If the responses reinforced concern, the court issued what it called a corrective placement. This often involved reassignment to distant regions where administrative activity was minimal. In more severe cases, the matter was forwarded to enforcement halls described in earlier chapters. The subject rarely contested these decisions. How could they refute a record preserved across years, written by many hands? detached from personal malice yet capable of shaping their future. The ledgers themselves remained untouched by emotion. Clerks updated them with the same precision used for tax registers and census records. Once decisions were made, entries relating to the individual were marked with a brief closing notation. Some notations indicated relocation. Others hinted at harsher outcomes. The pages did not provide commentary, only fact. Within the administrative compound, the Hall of Ledgers became a place that few wished to approach. Not because it held instruments of punishment, but because it stored memory, the kind of memory that persisted long after a person believed an old mistake forgotten. The court trusted these volumes more than testimony, for ink did not falter. In an empire defined by order, the ledgers offered a quiet reminder. A life could unravel not through a single act, but through patterns unnoticed until the moment they were read aloud. In the central years of a dynasty known for its rigid administrative order, a structure stood between the tax bureau and the military registry. It was not marked by banners or carved plaques, yet everyone who served in the capital recognized it from a distance. This was the Hall of Correction, a place where discipline was enacted with measured formality. No cries were heard from its chambers. Its significance lay not in spectacle but in procedure, and those summoned understood that the procession leading to its gate mattered as much as anything that happened inside. The procession always began at dawn. A messenger delivered a sealed order to the individual's residence, instructing them to appear before the hall for clarification of conduct. This phrase indicated that earlier inquiries, whether through documents, questioning, or observation, had revealed enough concern for escalation. The subject was not bound or escorted roughly. Instead, two attendants walked a deliberate pace ahead, setting a path through the administrative quarter. The slow rhythm emphasized that the matter was now part of official record. As they approached the hall, the subject passed buildings associated with their duties. Clerks at open windows lowered their voices. Couriers paused at intersections, allowing the procession to pass undisturbed. The court intended this ritualized silence to remind everyone of the seriousness of internal discipline. Even without public punishment, reputations shifted along these corridors with every such procession. The hall's entrance was simple, a wooden gate reinforced by stone pillars darkened by age. Inside, the first chamber held a table where a registrar copied the subject's name onto a fresh slip. This slip was placed beside earlier records gathered from inquiries in the previous chapter's behavior notes, inconsistencies in questioning, or ambiguous writings. Nothing was stated aloud. The registrar's brush alone set the tone of the proceeding. When summoned into the inner chamber, the subject encountered a setting designed more for administrative clarity than intimidation. A raised platform held a single chair for the presiding official, while two assistants stood at either side of the room. A narrow window allowed a blade of daylight to stretch across the floor, marking the space where the subject was to stand. The official read a summary of concerns, each phrased with restraint. The goal was not to accuse, but to establish grounds for correction. The first stage involved reaffirming earlier statements. The subject was asked to repeat explanations given during prior questioning. These repetitions mattered. A change in tone or emphasis could reinforce the court's impression that the earlier answers lacked sincerity. If the official deemed the explanations inadequate, the subject proceeded to the second stage, physical correction. The correction did not involve instruments of extreme punishment. Its purpose was to reinforce discipline, not inflict permanent harm. The court believed that physical endurance reflected moral alignment. In this stage, the subject was required to kneel on woven mats placed atop coarse sand. The duration was not announced. Assistants recorded posture, steadiness, and any attempt to shift weight. The official occasionally asked clarifying questions, observing how discomfort influenced the subject's response. If further correction was required, the subject was instructed to maintain a standing position with arms extended horizontally. This posture, traditionally used in earlier military drills, tested stamina and self-control. Assistants noted tremors, uneven breathing, and lapses in composure. These observations contributed to a final assessment delivered later. Throughout this process, no official raised their voice. Correction was administered with quiet rigor. Those in the hall believed that maintaining a calm atmosphere allowed truth and sincerity to surface. In rare cases, subjects responded with renewed steadiness, convincing the court that the earlier concerns stemmed from misunderstanding. More often, the strain revealed hesitation, reinforcing the belief that deeper issues existed. Once the correction concluded, the subject was escorted outside to await the decision. The presiding official reviewed all records, the procession, the chamber responses, the physical endurance notes, and drafted a recommendation. Outcomes varied. Some individuals returned to their posts with warnings. Others were reassigned to remote jurisdictions where their influence would diminish. A few were forwarded to higher authorities for penalties more severe than correction. The hall's attendants swept the chambers after each session, restoring them to quiet neutrality. To those who passed by later in the day, nothing suggested that a life had been altered within its walls. Yet the Hall of Correction played a crucial role in maintaining order. It served as the point where uncertainty transformed into consequence, where the empire shaped conduct not through dramatic spectacle, but through measured ritual. The procession to its gate remained a symbol throughout the administrative quarter, a reminder that discipline in ancient governance did not always rise from force. It grew from observation, repetition, and the steady weight of procedures carried out with precision. The administration maintained a firm belief that order could only be preserved when hidden associations were prevented from growing beyond notice. In every major settlement, officials trained to detect subtle shifts in behavior observed their surroundings with quiet discipline. These observers were not enforcers and carried no authority to detain anyone. Their task was to document patterns that suggested alliances forming outside the sanctioned hierarchy. The process often began with a simple report. A clerk noted that certain individuals met at irregular hours near a warehouse or that messages were being exchanged without passing through the designated registry. These small signals triggered a preliminary review. The supervising office examined the report and compared it to older records, checking whether the names had appeared in unrelated matters or whether the locations had a history of disputes. If enough overlap emerged, the matter progressed to a formal investigation. The investigators responsible for this next stage followed strict procedure. They arrived at the site unannounced but without force. Their presence alone indicated that the administration was aware of unusual activity. They inspected ledgers, examined storage containers, and questioned workers while making clear that the inquiry sought clarity, not punishment. This distinction mattered. It encouraged cooperation and minimized attempts to conceal information. Interviews were held in modest chambers attached to the local office. The investigators asked direct questions and avoided speculation. They noted how quickly individuals responded, whether they hesitated before offering explanations, and whether their accounts aligned with others. Inconsistencies did not result in immediate accusations. Instead, they were added to a growing set of observations used to understand the structure of any potential alliance. If evidence suggested that the group engaged in unsanctioned organization, investigators expanded their scope. They examined routes of communication, searching for patterns in written notes or deliveries. Even the absence of messages could prove significant. Silence sometimes indicated preparation, and investigators documented such periods with equal care. Objects discovered at these locations were also important. Tools arranged in unusual patterns, surplus supplies stored without explanation, or maps marked with specific outlines could suggest coordination. These items were sealed and transferred to the administrative record room. Their purpose was not interpreted hastily. Officials understood that misreading a sign could lead to unnecessary punishment or disrupt local trust. Once the investigators compiled their findings, the matter was reviewed by the prefectural office. If the report indicated only minor associations gatherings for trade, discussions about shared grievances, or coordination of local tasks, the administration issued a warning and requested formal registration of the group's activities. The goal was to return such gatherings to the regulated framework rather than dissolve them entirely. However, if the investigation revealed a structured network with undisclosed aims, the prefecture initiated corrective action. individuals believed to guide the group were summoned for questioning. This questioning differed from earlier interviews. It took place in a chamber arranged to emphasize the seriousness of the matter. Officials asked about motives, sources of guidance, and future plans. Even then, the approach remained measured. The administration understood that calm inquiry often yielded clearer truth than coercion. Those found to have organized such alliances without approval faced administrative penalties. They might be reassigned to distant regions, required to report regularly to supervisory offices, or placed under formal restrictions. The nature of the penalty depended on the scale of the group and its intentions. The administration's goal was to dissolve the network before it affected broader stability. Locations where activity had been discovered underwent a period of supervised operation. Officials inspected them at regular intervals, ensuring that any remaining participants complied with new regulations. This supervision continued for months, sometimes longer, depending on how quickly normal order returned. To the public, these investigations remained largely invisible. They produced no displays of force and few dramatic confrontations, yet their impact shaped daily life. The quiet movement of investigators through markets, workshops, and remote warehouses served as a reminder that the administration observed not only overt actions, but the subtle ties that bound people together. In many cases, the investigation concluded without punishment. Records simply noted the concerns, the inquiries, and the assessed outcome. These entries remained stored for future reference, forming a detailed archive of patterns that might one day reappear. The administration viewed this archive as essential. It allowed officials to respond early if former associations resurfaced with new intent. The investigation of hidden alliances thus formed a steady undercurrent within the governance of ancient times. It illustrated how control extended beyond public decrees and military displays. It lived in the quiet scrutiny of movements, conversations, and connections, a constant reminder that order depended on understanding not only individuals, but the bonds they formed, openly or in shadow. Across the administrative centers, a distinct set of offices existed for one purpose only: to evaluate loyalty. These offices were quiet, unadorned rooms staffed by clerks whose work rarely appeared in official edicts, but shaped the fate of many individuals. Their methods were steady rather than dramatic. They did not monitor behavior through force or intimidation. Instead, they collected information over long periods, studied patterns, and drew conclusions based on consistency rather than isolated mistakes. Each report that entered the office carried the same format: a clerk from a village, a supervisor from a workshop, or an overseer from a storage depot submitted observations. These observations described whether an individual fulfilled duties, maintained predictable routines, or deviated from expected conduct. The purpose was not to record wrongdoing, but to measure stability. A sudden change in behavior, arriving at different hours, holding meetings in secluded places, refusing customary tasks required additional attention. When such deviations occurred, the office compared the new report with older ones. They examined whether similar changes had happened in the past, whether the individual had once been monitored, or whether they were linked to others under review. Connections mattered. A single person acting irregularly might cause mild concern, but several individuals displaying related shifts suggested a developing issue. If the office determined that further assessment was needed, they initiated a loyalty review. This process did not involve interrogation or punishment. Instead, appointed officers visited the individual's place of work or residence. Their presence alone communicated the seriousness of the matter. They asked practical questions: whether the person had taken on additional burdens, whether illness affected their schedule, or whether they faced local disputes that disrupted their routine. These questions aimed to clarify the reason for the observed irregularity. In many cases, the explanation satisfied the officers. A change in workload, a family matter, or a seasonal shift in trade accounted for the difference. The officers recorded this information and returned it to the office, which closed the case without further action. However, when the explanations did not match the observed changes, the review continued. Officers then sought information from the wider community. They spoke with co-workers, neighbors, and supervisors to form a broader picture. They listened for subtle signals hesitation when giving answers, repeated claims made without evidence, or unusual attempts to avoid simple questions. These details, minor on their own, could indicate an attempt to conceal activity. The office compiled these findings into a formal report. The report did not determine guilt or innocence. Instead, it rated the individual's reliability on a scale used only internally. Those with high reliability remained undisturbed. Those with declining scores were placed under extended observation. This observation involved additional reports submitted at regular intervals. Individuals whose loyalty continued to decline faced administrative measures. They might be reassigned to tasks requiring constant oversight or relocated to distant regions where supervision was stronger. These actions were not presented as punishments. They were administrative adjustments designed to limit instability. The office's work extended beyond individuals. It monitored entire districts, noting whether patterns emerged across multiple families or workplaces. If a region displayed collective shifts, reduced participation in seasonal duties, reluctance to attend public announcements, or increased gatherings without recorded purpose, the office marked the district for broader review. This review involved visiting officials who assessed whether local administration had weakened or whether external influences had reached the region. Records from these offices form some of the most detailed documents of the era. Each entry contained dates, observations, explanations, and final assessments. They revealed how closely the administration watched not only those suspected of defiance, but also those who simply drifted from routine. These records were stored in long rows of wooden cabinets, each drawer representing the history of hundreds of individuals. To the general population, the existence of such offices remained known but rarely discussed. People understood that their behavior could be noted at any moment, not by soldiers or guards, but by ordinary clerks performing quiet work. This awareness shaped daily actions. Individuals maintained predictable routines, avoided unnecessary gatherings, and ensured that their duties remained visible. The pressure was subtle yet pervasive. Even so, the system allowed room for correction. The loyalty offices did not assume malicious intent at the first sign of irregularity. They relied on patterns, time, and the accumulation of detail. Many individuals passed through reviews without consequence. Their explanations held, their routines stabilized, and their records reflected normal conduct. Through these offices, the administration reinforced its belief that order depended not only on strict laws, but on a steady understanding of human behavior. Quiet monitoring, gradual assessment, and measured response formed the core of this system. It was a network of observation woven through daily life, shaping how communities worked, how disputes were settled, and how individuals learned to balance personal desire with the expectations of authority. In many administrative centers, silence was treated not as the absence of speech, but as a measurable quality. Officials believed that a person's ability to remain steady under quiet conditions revealed far more than outward expressions. Because of this belief, certain offices created methods designed to test how individuals reacted when placed in controlled stillness. These tests occurred in plain rooms with no decoration. A low table, a stone bench, and a single lantern were the only objects present. The individual being assessed sat alone while a recorder observed from an adjoining space through a narrow viewing slit. The purpose was simple: to see how a person behaved when deprived of distractions. Most individuals showed predictable responses. They shifted their posture, looked around the room, or clasped their hands together. These movements were noted but not considered significant. What the administrators watched for were changes that broke from the person's usual demeanor: restlessness that grew rather than faded, hesitation before answering basic questions, or an unusual interest in the shadows at the edge of the lantern's light. The recorder entered the room only after a set amount of time. Their questions were not confrontational. They asked about routine matters: how work had progressed, whether the household needed repairs, whether disputes had arisen among neighbors. These questions were deliberately ordinary. Officials believed that a person who struggled to answer simple inquiries after a period of silence might be concealing deeper concerns. If the individual responded calmly, the test concluded. A brief note was added to the administrative file, stating that no irregularities were detected. But if the answers came slowly, or if the individual raised unrelated topics, the recorder extended the session. They asked about the person's recent movements, the people they frequently met, and whether they had changed their usual habits. Movement of the hands, subtle adjustments in breathing, or long pauses before speaking were also recorded. These signs were combined with previous reports to determine whether the individual's behavior had shifted in ways that required further examination. Not every test involves spoken questions. In some cases, the individual received a practical task, arranging wooden tiles in a specific order, copying a symbol onto parchment, or counting grains from one bowl to another. Administrators believed these tasks revealed how well a person could maintain focus. An abrupt loss of concentration suggested internal distraction or anxiety, which they considered meaningful. The methods extended beyond individuals. Entire groups could be observed during community gatherings. Officials watched how people behaved during periods when speakers paused, whether the crowd maintained attention or turned toward one another, and whether anyone seemed preoccupied. These observations fed into broader assessments of community stability. The records produced from these tests contained no accusations. They did not claim wrongdoing. Instead, they documented behaviors expressed under controlled quiet. Over time, these records became part of a larger pattern. If the same person appeared in multiple tests with shifting responses, the administration flagged their file for additional monitoring. Sometimes these tests revealed simple causes. A person might be under stress from a poor harvest, a family illness, or a dispute with neighbors. When such explanations surfaced, officials recorded them and allowed the person to resume normal life. They viewed these challenges as temporary conditions rather than signs of defiance. But when the explanations did not align with observed patterns, the case moved forward. The individual might be asked to attend additional sessions or provide written statements describing recent activities. Officials compared these statements with reports from the person's workplace or district. Inconsistencies mattered. Even small variations were noted and reviewed. The community understood that these silent rooms existed, even though few spoke of them openly. People learned to maintain calm during pauses in conversation, to answer questions simply, and to avoid behaviors that might be misinterpreted. Silence became not only a condition, but a test that shaped how individuals carried themselves. To outsiders, these methods appeared mild. They lacked the dramatic force of traditional punishment, yet their influence was deep. They taught people that even stillness carried weight. A person's behavior during quiet moments could determine whether officials viewed them as stable or unpredictable. Through these tests, authority extended beyond the physical world of gates and patrols. It reached into the subtler domain of human demeanor. In this system, silence became a tool, and those who monitored it learned to read the smallest details as signs of future trouble or signs of continued order. In several regional administrations, night courts functioned as quiet centers of observation rather than places of formal judgment. These courts operated after dusk, when daily noise had faded and officials believed human behavior became more transparent. Individuals summoned to these sessions were not accused of wrongdoing. Instead, they were brought for evaluation when earlier reports suggested unusual changes in conduct or associations. The court was held in a hall lit by oil lamps set at a controlled distance from one another. The lighting created a pattern of alternating brightness and shadow. The arrangement was intentional. Officials believed that a person's orientation toward light or darkness revealed aspects of their temperament. Some leaned toward the lamps, speaking more readily in illumination, while others shifted toward the dimmer areas, answering slowly or avoiding direct attention. 3 watchers presided over each session. They were not judges in the conventional sense, and they issued no sentences. Their task was to observe. One listened to the voice, noting changes in tone, hesitation, or strained breath. Another watched bodily movement, recording how the individual placed their feet, whether their shoulders tensed or whether their hands tightened. The third watched the overall scene, tracking the flow of conversation and the response to silence. The session began with simple questions about work, travel, and family. These questions were repeated at intervals to see whether answers remained consistent. Watchers compared each response with previous administrative reports. Consistency was treated as a sign of stability. Variations, even minor ones, required explanation. The watchers also measured pacing. Individuals were sometimes instructed to walk from one end of the hall to the other. The floor was marked with faint lines that guided their steps, though most did not notice them. The watchers timed the movement, comparing it with expected rhythm. A slower pace suggested caution. An abrupt pause suggested uncertainty. People rarely realized how closely these details were assessed. A more subtle part of the evaluation involved the hall's acoustics. The walls were constructed to amplify certain sounds while muting others. Footsteps echoed sharply, while breathing remained soft. Watchers listened for variations: the uneven tap of a foot, a change in stride, or a shift in direction when the lamps flickered. They believed these reactions reflected impulses a person could not easily conceal. Some sessions involved objects placed in the center of the hall. These might include a sealed jar, a folded cloth, or a wooden box containing simple items. The watchers observed how individuals approached these objects, whether they hesitated before touching them, and whether curiosity, caution, or indifference guided their actions. The reactions were compared with responses to verbal questions, helping create a fuller picture of behavior. People often assumed the night court carried immediate consequences, but its purpose was longer term. The watchers compiled reports summarizing the individual's movements, expressions, and responses. These reports were sent to higher offices, where they were stored alongside economic records, tax documents, and community tallies. Over time, recurring patterns emerged. Individuals who showed stable behavior in multiple sessions were left alone. Those whose conduct shifted noticeably were monitored more closely. There were nights when the watchers observed groups rather than individuals. These sessions tested harmony among members of a household or workers from the same district. Group responses to silence, shared questions, and changes in lighting were recorded. Officials believed that discord revealed potential trouble long before it surfaced in public. Occasionally, the night court served a preventative function. When rumors of unrest circulated, the watchers summoned individuals who were considered influential within their communities. These sessions were not confrontational. Instead, officials looked for signs of confidence or hesitation, which they believed indicated whether a person might support or discourage disorder. Many never realized they had been evaluated in a night court. The watchers maintained discretion, and the summonses were framed as routine inquiries. Reports contained no accusations or penalties. They simply noted observations, treating human behavior as part of the broader system of governance. To the administration, the night court acted as an extension of the daylight world, a place where behavior could be examined without the distractions of noise, crowds, or daily obligations. The watchers believed that darkness revealed truths that sunlight concealed, and that a person's actions under controlled conditions provided the clearest indication of their reliability. Through these methods, authority reached beyond visible oversight. It entered the quiet hours, shaping how people carried themselves even when they believed no one was watching. Over time, communities understood that movement, silence, and stillness all held meaning. In this environment, the night court became not a place of verdicts, but a tool through which order was maintained with steady, persistent attention. Across many administrative centers, clerks maintained long registers dedicated not to crimes or taxes, but to patterns of conduct that seemed to fall outside the expected rhythm of daily life. These records were stored in quiet rooms attached to government offices, where shelves held scrolls arranged by season, region, and circumstance. The system was designed to trace subtle shifts in behavior that might suggest tension, instability, or emerging disputes within a community. Each entry was brief. Clerks avoided interpretation, limiting themselves to clear descriptions of actions that others had reported. A sudden change in routine, a refusal to participate in communal tasks, or repeated appearances in unfamiliar places. The intent was not to accuse, but to create a reference point that might later reveal larger patterns. Officials believed that nothing unsettled a community abruptly. Signs often appeared long before matters reached open conflict. Information reached the registers through a wide network of observers. Some were appointed to their roles, while others passed along details during regular administrative visits. They were expected to note behaviors that deviated from established norms, though they rarely confronted the individuals involved. Instead, observations were recorded quietly, forming a background layer of knowledge that officials consulted when making decisions. Clerks added annotations only when necessary. These annotations did not judge the behavior, but described circumstances that might influence it. For example, a change in work pattern could reflect illness, travel, or a shift in household responsibilities. Officials valued clarity over speculation, believing that records must remain neutral if they were to serve future inquiries accurately. Once compiled, the registers circulated through supervisory offices. Each office reviewed the entries, marking those that required attention. Some entries were set aside for later verification, while others were forwarded to units responsible for monitoring public order. Officials viewed the registers as early indicators of potential unrest, allowing them to respond before tensions solidified. In certain seasons, the registers grew thicker. Periods of drought, migration, or resource shortages produced noticeable changes in behavior across entire regions. Clerks responded by expanding the criteria for observation, noting patterns that appeared widespread rather than isolated. Officials used these observations to adjust policies, redirect supplies, or dispatch additional personnel. The registers also played a role in administrative appointments. Candidates for local positions were sometimes evaluated partly on whether their names appeared in earlier entries. Even minor references could prompt closer examination during the selection process. The belief was that those responsible for guiding communities should have stable and predictable conduct, free from indicators that might suggest hidden discord. In some cases, families became aware of entries concerning their members. These discoveries rarely led to conflict, though they created a sense of caution. Households encouraged consistent routines and discouraged actions that could be easily misinterpreted. Over time, communities internalized the idea that steadiness was essential not only for harmony, but also for avoiding administrative attention. The registers served an archival purpose as well. Older volumes were preserved in dedicated rooms where they could be consulted during investigations. Officials sometimes traced a single name across decades, examining whether actions that once seemed insignificant had developed into more substantial patterns. Through this long view, authorities believed they could understand the roots of complex disputes. Although the registers influenced decisions across many levels of governance, they remained largely unseen by the people whose lives they documented. The system operated quietly, without public announcements or displays of authority. Its effectiveness depended on restraint, discretion, and the slow accumulation of detail rather than sudden intervention. Over time, the presence of the registers shaped how communities behaved. People adjusted their routines, moderated their speech, and maintained predictable habits. The knowledge that unusual conduct might be recorded, even without immediate consequence, created a subtle pressure toward conformity. In this environment, calm, consistency, and clear patterns became essential qualities for anyone seeking stability. Through these methods, the registers fulfilled their role not as instruments of punishment, but as tools of anticipation. By tracing the small movements of daily life, they allowed officials to sense change before it fully formed, maintaining order through quiet observation rather than visible force. Within certain administrative compounds, there existed small enclosed chambers known as quiet rooms. These rooms were neither punitive nor ceremonial. Instead, they served as controlled spaces where individuals were brought when their actions, statements, or recent behavior required further understanding. The intent was not interrogation, but observation under conditions free from the influences of crowds, noise, and daily obligations. Each room followed the same layout. The walls were smooth, undecorated, and coated in a muted mineral wash that softened the light. A single lamp sat near the floor, creating a low, steady glow that cast no sharp shadows. Officials believed that an environment with minimal visual stimulation encouraged clarity and accuracy in human expression. A wooden bench stood at the center, unmarked and simple, with enough space for an individual to sit comfortably without distraction. Sessions in the quiet rooms were conducted by a small group of attendants trained in calm, measured interaction. Their role was not to demand answers, but to create an atmosphere where thoughts emerged naturally. Attendants spoke with slow pacing, leaving long pauses between questions. These pauses were intentional, allowing individuals to settle into the silence and respond without the pressure of continuous dialogue. The topics discussed were broader than those raised in the night courts or registers. Attendants often began by asking about daily routines, recent changes, or ongoing responsibilities. They paid close attention not only to the responses, but also to the rhythm of breathing, the spacing of words, and the gestures that accompanied them. Minor details, a shift of the hands, a tilt of the head, or the steady tapping of a foot were noted for later review. Some sessions required the room to remain silent for extended periods. In these moments, attendants observed how individuals handled stillness. Officials believed that silence revealed tensions or ease more reliably than speech. A person who settled comfortably into the quiet showed steadiness. One who grew restless, frequently adjusted their posture, or looked repeatedly toward the door, indicated unsettled thoughts that required further attention. In certain cases, objects were placed on a low platform before the individual. These objects were simple: a folded cloth, a sealed envelope, or a wooden token. The individual was asked to examine the object and describe whatever came to mind. Attendants watched for the reactions that accompanied these descriptions. The exercise was not meant to uncover hidden information, but to assess emotional responses under minimal guidance. Sessions rarely resulted in immediate conclusions. Attendants compiled observations into detailed summaries, which were sealed and sent to higher offices. These reports contained no accusations. Instead, they recorded impressions that might help clarify earlier entries in the registers or support recommendations for future monitoring. Officials valued consistency across these summaries, comparing them with notes from night courts and other administrative systems. The quiet rooms also served another purpose. They provided individuals with a structured environment to reflect on their own conduct. Many left the sessions not distressed, but contemplative. Some requested additional time in the chamber, using the stillness to consider recent events or decisions. Over time, the rooms became associated not only with administrative review, but also with personal clarity. Although the quiet rooms influenced governance, they remained concealed from daily life. Their presence was rarely discussed openly. Families knew that certain matters might lead a person into one of these chambers, yet they did not view it as punishment. Rather, it was understood as part of the broader system that sought stability through observation rather than force. Officials saw the quiet rooms as essential to maintaining order. They believed that understanding the subtle layers of human behavior required spaces where distractions could not interfere. The rooms allowed them to observe patterns that would remain invisible in larger, more active environments. With time, the practice shaped community behavior. People adopted steadier postures in formal settings, moderated their tone during disagreements, and approached change cautiously. Even without entering a quiet room, many lived with the awareness that calm conduct was a valued quality. In this way, the quiet rooms contributed to a system of governance built on attentiveness. By reducing noise, slowing speech, and isolating small details, they helped officials interpret movements of society that could not be seen through documents or public appearances alone. Through these measured observations, order was maintained in a manner that relied less on overt authority and more on an unbroken awareness of how individuals carried themselves within the wider structure. In several administrative complexes, there existed a long, narrow corridor used for a distinct form of evaluation. It was neither a punishment walkway nor a ceremonial aisle. Instead, officials used it to observe how individuals behaved when moving through a space designed to influence perception and awareness. This corridor, often referred to simply as the passage, became an essential tool for understanding temperament, confidence, and internal balance. The passage began with a threshold marked by a stone slab set slightly lower than the surrounding floor. Anyone entering stepped down before walking forward. Officials believed that even this small shift in ground level revealed how a person adapted to sudden changes. Some paused momentarily, others adjusted their stride, while a few stepped forward without hesitation. All of these reactions were quietly recorded. The corridor itself stretched longer than most expected. Its floor followed a precise alignment, directing movement in a straight line from the entrance to a final archway. Lamps were placed at measured intervals along one wall, while the opposite wall remained in shadow. This pattern created alternating environments of brightness and dimness. Observers stationed unseen behind partitions monitored how individuals navigated these shifts. Some walked more confidently in the light, others steadied themselves in darker sections, and a few altered their pace unconsciously as the illumination changed. Sound played an important role. The corridor was constructed with materials that magnified even the smallest footfall. A slow step produced a long echo, while a quicker stride sharpened into a crisp, brief resonance. Officials listened for hesitations, for uneven rhythms, and for the way footsteps changed when passing through illuminated or shadowed zones. Officials believed that sound revealed intentions even before expression or posture did. Midway through the passage, a narrow alcove opened on one side. It contained no object and no instruction. Its purpose was simply to test reaction. Some individuals ignored it and continued walking. Others paused to look inside, unsure whether they were expected to engage with the space. A few stepped close to the alcove, studying it quietly before resuming their path. These responses were noted without comment, providing insight into curiosity, caution, or reluctance. The corridor ended at a final archway, where a single attendant waited. The attendant did not speak. Instead, they gestured toward a wooden tablet placed on a small platform. Individuals were asked to lift the tablet and carry it back through the corridor to the entrance. The weight of the tablet varied according to a schedule known only to administrators. Observers focused on how the added weight affected movement, whether posture shifted, whether steps grew slower, or whether the return path altered in pace or confidence. Once the tablet was returned to its place, the session ended. Individuals were not informed of their performance or its significance. They simply left the corridor and returned to their regular duties. Officials later compared observations from multiple sessions, tracing long-term patterns rather than isolated reactions. The corridor passage became a subtle measure in administrative decision-making. Those who demonstrated consistent balance in light and shadow, steady rhythm in footfall, and clarity in navigating the alcove were considered stable. Those whose behavior shifted unpredictably were observed more closely or invited to additional evaluations in other chambers. Over time, knowledge of the corridor spread quietly through communities. People spoke of it not with fear, but with the understanding that it was part of how order was maintained. Many practiced steady walking in their daily routines, adopting calm movements and deliberate pacing. Even those who never entered the passage adjusted their behavior, knowing the corridor existed as a standard of conduct. The passage served the administration not through force, but through observation and the natural responses of individuals moving through a carefully constructed environment. By shaping light, sound, and spatial awareness, officials gained insight into qualities that written reports could not reveal. Through this simple act of walking, the state learned how its people adapted, perceived, and carried themselves within the structure of authority. In certain administrative complexes, there were chambers reserved for apprentice officials, regarded as essential to understanding human intention, deliberate silence. Unlike the quiet rooms used for reflection, these chambers were larger and built for extended stays. Their purpose was not to elicit speech, but to observe how individuals responded to the sustained absence of external cues. Authorities believed that prolonged quiet revealed tendencies invisible in ordinary environments. The chambers were constructed with thick walls lined in layered stone to absorb sound. Even footsteps produced only the faintest echo. Lamps were placed behind carved screens, allowing light to diffuse evenly across the space. The result was an environment without shadows or sharp contrasts. Officials considered such neutrality crucial. for it prevented the room itself from shaping a person's movements. Before entering, individuals were given a simple instruction: wait. No duration was mentioned, and no task was assigned. The uncertainty was intentional. Officials watched from concealed vantage points, noting the choices individuals made when left without direction. Some sat immediately on the bench provided. Others paced the perimeter, testing the room's limits. A few remained standing, unsure whether movement would be interpreted as restlessness. The first signs officials looked for were patterns of stillness. A person who settled into a steady posture was thought to possess clarity and self-control. Those who shifted frequently, tapped their fingers, or altered their breathing rhythm suggested internal unease. Observers recorded each gesture and pause, mapping subtle variations across the session. After a period of waiting, different attendants entered the chamber one at a time. They did not speak. Instead, they performed small actions, adjusting a lamp, placing a folded cloth on the bench, or setting a cup of water on the floor. These actions were designed to test attention. Officials noted whether individuals acknowledged the attendants, ignored them, or altered their behavior in response. In some sessions, a soft chime echoed through the chamber at irregular intervals. The sound was gentle and brief, disappearing almost as soon as it appeared. Individuals reacted differently. Some turned their heads toward the noise. Others remained still. A few looked upward as if expecting additional cues. The chime was not a signal, but a measurement of responsiveness under constrained conditions. Near the end of the session, the chamber's atmosphere shifted slightly. The lights dimmed by a small degree, barely noticeable to most. Observers marked whether individuals registered the change. Sensitivity to subtle environmental shifts was considered an important indicator of alertness and adaptability. When the attendant finally opened the door, individuals were invited to leave without comment. Many hesitated, uncertain whether they were expected to step forward immediately or await further instruction. This hesitation, too, was noted. Officials believed that the manner in which a person re-entered the world of sound reflected how they handled transitions between quiet and activity. Reports produced from these sessions were thorough but impartial. They did not assign judgment. Instead, they created a profile of how individuals behaved when their environment offered no guidance. These profiles were sometimes compared with entries from the registers or observations from corridor passages. Together, they formed a layered understanding of a person's reliability and self-governing tendencies. Over time, the existence of the silent chambers shaped the wider society as subtly as the registers and night courts. People became more aware of how they carried themselves in moments of pause. They moderated abrupt gestures, steadied their breathing, and practiced maintaining composed silence during communal gatherings. The idea that stillness held meaning became deeply rooted in daily life. To the authorities, the chambers demonstrated how order could be upheld without force. By observing natural reactions to quiet, they gained insight into how individuals might behave in moments of uncertainty or strain. The chambers did not produce verdicts. They produced understanding, shaped through quiet patience rather than coercion. Through these methods, governance extended into realms where sound and direction fell away, revealing what remained when people were left alone with their thoughts and movements. The chambers of deliberate silence became a quiet foundation of oversight, ensuring that stability grew not only from law, but from the subtle ways individuals responded to stillness itself. Beyond all chambers of evaluation and all corridors of observation, there stood a modest structure known only to those who worked in the highest branches of administration. It was called the House of Resolved Names. Unlike the ledger, which recorded decisions taken at the end of long deliberations, this house served as the final repository for everything that followed. It was not a place of punishment or reward, nor was it marked on any map. It functioned quietly, preserving the last written traces of individuals whose cases had moved through the entire system. The structure itself was unadorned. Its walls were built from dense plaster mixed with clay and powdered stone, forming a surface that showed no decoration or inscription. The absence of markings was purposeful. The house existed outside public recognition, standing as a neutral archive rather than a memorial. Only a small door, fitted with a wooden panel worn smooth by careful use, signaled its entrance. Inside, the house contained a single hall divided into several alcoves. Each alcove held wooden tablets and sealed slips of paper arranged in narrow shelves. These tablets were not records of behavior or decisions. Instead, they contained concise summaries of each resolved case, short statements that noted the steps taken to restore balance, the paths chosen by the council, and the outcomes that followed. Officials believed that understanding these outcomes was essential for guiding future governance. Every tablet followed the same structure. The first line recorded the individual's name, or, in rare cases, a symbol assigned when anonymity was required. The second line stated the measure enacted, written in plain, direct language. The final lines described the long-term effect of the decision on community stability, recorded years after the measure had occurred. These reflections were added only when officials could observe the lasting influence of earlier choices. The house was also used to store letters from local administrators who oversaw the aftermath of difficult cases. These letters described quiet shifts within villages, changes in agricultural behavior, or the restoration of patterns once disrupted. They were not evaluative. They simply documented how communities adjusted once a destabilizing influence had been removed or redirected. Clerks filed these letters alongside the tablets, ensuring that each case contained both the decision and its consequences. Access to the house was tightly controlled. Only a few officials entered regularly, and they did so with deliberate care. They walked slowly along the alcoves, reviewing past cases when new situations arose elsewhere. The intent was to ensure continuity. No decision should be made in isolation when the lessons of earlier experiences remained available. The house also contained a narrow courtyard enclosed by tall walls. A single tree stood at its center, chosen not for symbolic meaning, but for durability. Leaves fell into the courtyard during certain seasons, gathering in small piles near the walls. Attendants swept these leaves regularly, maintaining a sense of order in the space. The courtyard allowed officials to step briefly into fresh air between long periods of review, encouraging clear thinking before returning to the records. Over time, the House of Resolved Names shaped administrative culture in quiet but meaningful ways. Officials learned to approach decisions with patience, knowing that their actions would one day be stored within the house's alcoves. They understood that each case would be studied by future generations, not for blame, but for guidance. This awareness cultivated restraint, reflection, and a respect for slow, deliberate judgment. Still, the house remained unknown to most people. Communities sensed the effects of the system, but rarely saw its inner workings. They felt the restoration of stability, the quiet resolution of conflicts, and the disappearance of underlying tensions. Yet they did not know how these changes were recorded or studied. The house stood as the unseen end of a long administrative pathway, carrying forward knowledge that shaped governance across eras. In this final structure, the system completed its cycle. Observations from night courts, notes from quiet rooms, traces from corridor passages, decisions written in the ledger all found their conclusion in the House of Resolved Names. The house preserved not only actions taken, but the outcomes that followed, allowing authority to grow wiser over time. Through its simple walls and silent alcoves, the house ensured that no decision existed alone. Each became part of a living record that guided the next generation of officials, allowing stability to be maintained through memory, reflection, and the steady accumulation of understanding. At the highest level of administration, far above the night courts, observation corridors, and silent chambers, existed an archive known simply as the ledger. Unlike other records, which noted behavior or monitored patterns, the ledger preserved decisions made when all earlier methods had failed to restore stability. It was reserved for cases in which an individual's actions were believed to threaten the harmony of a community or disrupt essential order. Its existence was discreet, known only to a few who held the authority to enact its entries. The ledger was kept in a long wooden chest sealed with lacquer and bound in bronze. It rested in a chamber without windows, illuminated only by a single lamp suspended from the ceiling. The air inside the room held a faint scent of ink and mineral dust. Each page in the ledger was thick, made from pressed fibers selected for durability. Officials understood that decisions recorded here might influence many years to come. When an individual's conduct raised persistent concern, reports from the registers, passages, and quiet rooms were assembled into a single dossier. High officials reviewed this dossier in silence, comparing earlier observations with recent actions. They looked not for dramatic incidents, but for the accumulation of small patterns that suggested a trajectory. If the dossier revealed consistent disruption, the case was brought before the keeper of the ledger. The keeper did not pass judgment alone. A council of advisors sat with them, each carrying experience from different branches of administration: agriculture, taxation, public order, and regional management. Their role was to consider how an individual's behavior intersected with the functioning of society. They weighed not only the actions themselves, but the potential consequences of allowing those patterns to continue. When deliberation concluded, 3 paths lay open. The first and most common was restoration. Individuals might be guided back through further observation, assigned work designed to re-establish routine, or paired with local leaders who would help stabilize their behavior. Many cases ended here, quietly resolved, without ever reaching the ledger. The second path involved containment. This did not mean physical confinement, but restriction from certain roles and responsibilities. Officials believed that limiting influence was often enough to prevent disruption from spreading. Those placed under containment guidelines continued their daily lives, though always under subtle watch. The third path, the one recorded in the ledger, marked decisions considered irreversible. These measures were enacted when officials believed restoring or containing an individual would no longer preserve the greater balance. The precise nature of these measures varied across regions and eras, but they shared a common purpose: to protect the broader structure by removing a destabilizing element from its core. Entries in the ledger were written with deliberate formal language. A single line might represent months of observation and deliberation. Names were recorded without flourish. Dates were written precisely. The measure taken was described plainly, with no additional commentary or judgment. Officials understood that the ledger was not a place for expression. It was a record of actions taken for the sake of order. Once an entry was completed, the page was dusted with a fine mineral powder to set the ink. The ledger was then closed until the next review. Decisions recorded within it were never discussed publicly, nor were they referenced in other administrative documents. Yet over time, communities sensed when such measures had been enacted. The absence of certain individuals, the quiet reassignment of responsibilities, or the sudden stability of a troubled region hinted that the system had intervened at a deeper level. Though the ledger operated in secrecy, its influence was widely felt. People learned that conduct was not judged only by outward actions, but by consistency, temperament, and the ability to maintain harmony. Families encouraged steady routines, avoiding behaviors that might attract prolonged observation. The idea of balance became woven into daily life, shaping how people acted in public and private spaces. To the administration, the ledger represented the final step of governance, a point reached only after every other method had been exhausted. It embodied the belief that order was built not on punishment alone, but on understanding the full spectrum of human behavior, from small gestures in dim corridors to decisions made in the stillness of silent chambers. Through this system, ancient authority maintained stability across vast regions and diverse communities. The ledger ensured that even in moments of uncertainty, there remained a structured path toward resolution, guided by observation, patience, and the quiet but unwavering pursuit of order.